Welcome everyone. Anna, today we're going to talk about one of the hardest design exercises we have, which is deciding about how to put our concept in a poster. Conveniently named a concept poster. Are you familiar with this exercise?
I am familiar. I use it all the time.
So tell us a little bit about what is a concept poster and how do we actually use it?
A concept poster is a tool that can be used in so many scenarios, but most of the time it's built in order to gain alignment on the team about what is it that we're building and for whom. And it forces the team to articulate the specifics about their ideas. Because oftentimes we're saying, we're gonna build a wearable device for measuring blood pressure.
Okay.
And then
I've heard this one before.
You've heard this one before, but then you have an idea of what it's gonna look like. I have an idea what it's gonna look like, and our boss probably has a completely different idea. And if we don't articulate this in some shape or form, we're all gonna walk away with different assumptions, and later we're gonna have questions for each other. So the concept poster is a way to make the implicit explicit.
It's such an interesting point. Just as you were saying that example off your cuff, I realized that, some people think in terms of blood pressure as, going to a doctor twice a year to get measured, or doing the at-home cuff,
right,
or now wearing, any type of smartwatch or a pedometer that has all sorts of bells and whistles, or frankly, rings. But candidly, we don't know where it's going to go next, right? Maybe the sensor is going to be on the inside of your glasses, or, in some other type of accessory. Fair enough?
Exactly. And a lot of the times when we're early in a project, we don't articulate those things because partially we don't want to box ourselves in, but also sometimes we kind of have a hope in the back of our mind. We're like, I hope it's going to be a wrist, whatever bracelet, right? But you don't say it out loud, and you drive specific activities, requirements, and all these things. Like we go down the pathway of building a product, but if we didn't agree on what this is going to look like, we didn't have a chance to ask each other those questions, like, why are we building another wristband?
Okay, fair enough. And in fact, you bring up a really interesting point. So a lot of the exercises and templates that people have already watched videos on are kind of origination exercises, or building creativity, or generative in nature. Whereas what you're talking to me sounds more of like an organization mechanism. Are there exercises or methods that oftentimes come before the concept poster that help us figure out, like, well, who is our actual target audience? Or are we narrowing down to what we wear on our wrist, or we have on our fingers, or around our heads? Like, what comes before this phase?
Yeah, oftentimes it would be your basic research, right? It could be research with actual people. You're talking to your target audiences. You're figuring out what are their pain points. What do they want to solve? What is the current state of the world look like? But also you might be doing competitor research. You might look at what other blood pressure monitoring mechanisms are out there. And what I like to do in those scenarios is almost build the pre-poster before you build a poster.
Oh, interesting. Right? It's like a pre-retro almost.
Exactly. So like you might go to Google Images and you might search for some images related to blood pressure, and they might be specific devices and technologies, but it might just be people suffering, right? And you bring that empathy in. What I do is I just copy pictures and paste them into my Miro boards to create a sort of a mood board.
Ah, okay.
And as I'm processing let's say I did some observations, or maybe I did some interviewing with people with high blood pressure, I might hear really good quotes from them about why it's difficult to monitor blood pressure, what comes up. I might actually like copy and paste that little quote and make it really big and just have it sit there, and it's like sort of sitting there looking at me. I might use it in a poster, or I might not, but it gives me material to work with.
Well, I like how you're framing this concept poster as almost a magnet. So it could collect the how might we statements, it could abstract or take away from a persona, it might be from contextual inquiry we've done, sort of going into the environment. In our case, we'll show in a minute, of a clinician or a traveling nurse and understanding what they've done. But it also could just be everything we think about the experience in order to challenge and test along our way.
Yeah, and everything we think about our capabilities. So for example, one thing that I really like to include in concept posters is feasibility, right? If we have engineers in a room, for example, and they know that some things are possible and some things are not, and we want to put some guardrails around this experience, we might want to have them express this and say, well, it's not going to be a physical device because we're a software company. So we're, those kinds of things.
Or supply chain is way out of whack right now.
Sure. Well, yes.
Which we all can relate to if you've had to build any type of physical environment or hardware or device. Okay, so it's an interesting thing here. Now, there's always a tension, which we'll highlight and probably should take on in its own video, around what happens if you are being too constrained in the beginning and only thinking about what existing technology or services, capabilities, or ways of working you have. Or on the other side, if you're too abstracted or too visionary, futuristic, then nothing's ever going to get recognized. Any kind of rules of thumb or basic understandings about, how do we manage that tension? So, the product person says, well, this is what people are going to need in 3 years or we're not going to be in business. And the engineer says, yeah, but this is all the APIs I have today. How do we find a reasonable ground through the lens of a concept poster?
Yeah, so I think we should agree before we go into the concept poster exercise, we should agree what is this concept poster of, right? Is this a moonshot and we're just trying to get what is, like, if we had no constraint, I like to use the word, if we had a magic wand, right? If we had a magic wand, what would it be? And then maybe we want to say, well, what can we do today, tomorrow, or 1 month from now, right? That framing is really important for the concept poster not to be all over the place, because it would lose its usefulness. But what's really important is that regardless of whether or not you're designing a moonshot or you're making something you can make next week, the human needs will be the same. And the crucial part of the concept poster is the who, right? The user, and what needs we're trying to address. Like, what is the current problem? Oftentimes I see, and we have in this example, you want to illustrate what current state actually looks like. And that is not going to change regardless of whether we're building a moonshot or solution for tomorrow.
Okay, now let me ask a clarifying question, because you bring up this really interesting point, which is, not all the technology we want is stuff we have today. And, the joke is, if you talk to a sci-fi writer, they can describe everything we need, right? Teleportation. I think, children of the 80s like myself are still waiting on jetpacks and the like, at a really accessible level. So we know how to describe it. Is that okay if I describe something on my concept poster that I physically, based on the laws of physics or the know-how today or from a budgetary point, can't actually execute tomorrow?
Yeah, I think that's okay, because it helps you crystallize what the goals are. So for example, you're saying that I want to get, like, the reason you want a jetpack is because you want to get from point A to point B fast, and you don't care about the journey, right? So that need is not going away. So expressing that and puts the finger on this problem of you wanting to get there stat and not caring about the journey. So then as a team, we might have a conversation and say, okay, can't have jetpacks tomorrow.
Okay.
But what can we have?
Fingers crossed, though. Okay, very good. All right, so I think we've talked a little bit about this. Let's kind of put our attention to the template here. And I understand that, so we have some instructions here, largely echoing what Anna has already shared with us around organizing basic information. I thought we'd come down to your example output you are kind enough to help us organize. And I see a couple of different rows. Now, it's important to reinforce before we get too prescriptive in this that concept posters do come in a lot of formats, a lot of phases, a lot of iterations and ideation. So I guess the sort of quick summarization is there's no one way to do a concept poster.
Absolutely not. What's important is to decide up front what's important to you. Are you visualizing current state and a future state, for example, like in this case, or is the poster just about the future state? And then, yes, there's no rules, but generally you will find common elements such as who is this for, what is this, what does this look like, what does the experience feel like? Typically those 4 things will always be there.
Okay, great. And in fact, you've highlighted kind of our first row here. So we see this clinician emphasis as far as where we are. Now, I also see the power of a digital collaboration tool coming to life here, because, if you ask for the wrong stereotype or the wrong person, right, there's a certain way everyone might view a nurse from 1950 versus 2000 versus 2050. And what I really like about what you've already illustrated here is Miro gives me the ability to have these fast and instantaneous feedback loops to say, this is what I mean when I say nurse. Is that the right takeaway?
That's exactly the right takeaway. And that's why I really like making this visual and asking the team to, I literally put a timer in my Miro and say, 2 minutes, go find every image you can find, right, and bring it back. And that's where we can have those discussions. Back to that blood pressure monitoring project that I just mentioned earlier, we had an experience where we went to get those pictures of wearables, and some of us brought in wearables that are on our wrist, and some of us brought wearables that are on our cuff.
Sure.
And we were like, oh, we didn't talk about this, right? This distinction. So that forced this conversation, and that could only happen visually, because there's no guarantee that one of us would put the location of the monitor on a post-it.
Yeah, well said. I mean, in fact, it gets to the highlight of someone's like, oh, I put it on my arm, and someone else says, oh yeah, I put it on my arm, and all of a sudden everyone thinks they're in alignment, but we're actually operating in parallel. Great example, Anna. Okay, so I see other things in here about key characteristics, goals, and needs. Now, candidly, this feels pretty similar to a persona kind of ingredient set of cards, right? I mean, some of these things like goals and objectives, kind of attributes or characteristics of a population, is it fair to say that this is partially overlapping with some of the ways we might have already done work to build a persona?
Yeah, 100%. I'm a big believer in not sticking to just one kind of artifact in your project.
Okay.
Ideally, your artifacts support each other, right? So hopefully on the same mirror board, we have somewhere on the side, we have our personas right there. And let's say one of our personas is a traveling nurse, and now we're doing a concept poster of a product idea for that traveling nurse. So this way we connect a specific person with specific needs, but also so that we, whenever we present this later, we don't have to have people go through a million of these artifacts. We just put key ingredients right here.
Yeah, in fact, what I love about your point is I zoom out on our template here, I realize that we actually have provided 4 different concept posters. And what you're making me think is, the existing maybe sort of singular or oversimplified definition of a traveling nurse was, she or he was literally moving states or countries, but actually what we know now is a traveling nurse can actually be localized. Right. Or a traveling nurse may be earlier in their career, or she or he might be late in their career. They might be specialized or a generalist, right? Expertise in a certain unit like the cardiovascular floor, right. Or actually, frankly, on triage or outpatient or admission, ambulatory, surgical, etc. Is that sort of the start to why we might have multiple different concept posters, or is there a time dimension here?
Yeah, that is one reason to have multiple. Another is if we're looking for a variety of ideas, we might just split up our teams into sub-teams and each team generate their own posters so that they don't influence each other and we don't get into groupthink. That's another reason to do it, but yes, absolutely. Time factor is another one. Earlier you talked about designing something for now versus a moonshot, but also we might think about other kinds of time aspects.
We now see some understanding of who it's for, what the key characteristics are, and the goals and objectives needs. And I appreciate your nudge to say maybe we should have these personas to the left or right of this particular frame. There's also this interesting juxtaposition in things we think of as swim lanes. So one swim lane here, or the middle row, is the current experience, and then below that is actually the ideal experience. First off, why are we doing a baseline and then an aspiration? And why are we putting them on the same poster if our job is to build something new?
Yeah, so think about a job of a poster, right? When you walk down the hallway and you see a poster for a concert, it tells you everything you need to know all in one place. You don't need any supporting information. It kind of tells you what, where, when, and how, right?
Yeah,
and
makes
it probably
you present, brings you into it.
A lot of the times I think about these posters as if I showed this to somebody, could they get an understanding of my entire project, of why am I doing this, and where the delta is. So for those reasons, including some kind of a timeline of this is what it's there now, helps me empathize with those users and say, oh, that's what I'm fixing. Because if we just say we're trying to improve mobility for traveling nurses, we don't actually know what's the problem. Right? Here, for this is structured as a storyboard, it doesn't have to be, but here in the storyboard, I can see clearly where the problem is, and then boom, I have a solution. So Excellent. That just makes that mental connection really quick.
What you're also bringing to mind is one of the techniques I use a lot is, there's people that are going to build your experience in your service, in this case, perhaps scheduling or mobility applications to support clinicians on the move. The reality, though, is there needs to be some basic awareness and inventory of how you've invested to date. So when I think about the current experience, I ask myself, well, who has cut a check or invested in a system or deployed a product or service to already do something? And can we make sure that they feel seen enough so they don't say, well, Adam or Anna, did you know that we've already done this? Exactly. So I like to bring them into kind of our headspace and meet together. Then I loved how you kind of frame this ideal experience, right? The idea is, okay, now here's where I'm going next for my solution. Now, is this solution all-inclusive or representative? So I noticed in here that we have things like, they get an SMS and there's a network car like an Uber or a Lyft, etc., that comes to you and then it takes them to work and now they're officially on time. But the truth is, we're not sure in any moment if SMS is going to be our future or if Uber and Lyft are going to be the brands that exist. It may not even be when we see this video in the future. So are these placeholders and demonstrable about the system of thinking? Is this specific recommendations of what to go do right now?
These are not specific recommendations. More often than not, they are just trying to make you think, and they're trying to force this conversation so that then when we as a team look at this poster, we can say, okay, let's talk about that SMS piece. I don't know if we can do the SMS. What if it was internal messaging because it needs to be secure, or maybe it's not messaging. But see, now we're zeroing in on this component and we're actually having a conversation about it, which is so important. These tools are all conversation starters and they're ways to gain alignment. So if it's starting a conversation, I say it's doing a good job.
All right, excellent, Anna. So I think we've covered the basics here, and we've also highlighted the idea around why we have multiple concept posters. So with that in mind, this is your opportunity to go out and explore. A concept poster does not need to be about your day job or what you spend the majority of your time on. You can use these concept posters around the idea of creating an ideal vacation experience, how to manage your healthcare moment or being or receiving care, or anything in between. So thank you so much, Anna, for joining us and being our masterful guide throughout our journey, and good luck to everyone else who's going to try your first concept poster or ultimately learn just one more way of ultimately executing this thoughtful, design-centered approach. Good luck. Talk to you soon.